From the JAMA Network, this is JAMA Author Interviews. Conversations with authors exploring the latest clinical research, reviews, and opinion featured in JAMA.
I'm Michael Berkowitz, Deputy Editor at JAMA. I'm enormously privileged today to talk to Dr. Abraham Verghese of Stanford University. He's no stranger to JAMA readers and listeners of our podcasts. He's the Linda R. Meyer and Joan F. Lane Provostial Professor of Medicine and Vice Chair for the Theory and Practice of Medicine in the Department of Medicine at Stanford. He directs Stanford's Presence program, which supports research, dialogue, and collaboration to advance human experience in medicine. He's the author of the best-selling novel Cutting for Stone, which has remained a favorite among physicians and the general public since its publication in 2009. And he's just published his long-awaited second novel, The Covenant of Water, which is what we'll talk about today. And he was just named a 2023-24 Guggenheim Fellow for writing. Abraham, welcome, and a huge congratulations on the fellowship and on the new book.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I was particularly excited to see an excerpt from Covenant published in JAMA. I don't know if that's a first, but it sure felt like a first to me.
We were so happy to do it. Let's start. Just tell listeners about the book. What stories does it tell, and what's it about?
Yeah, so this novel is set in the south of India and also in Glasgow, and it's set in the state of Kerala, where my parents are from. I didn't grow up there. I grew up in Africa, but very familiar with Kerala from annual vacations and from when I was in medical school as well. It's a story set between 1900 and 1977, and it largely follows one family, the Parambal family, as they're called. And they're from a small insular Christian community in Kerala who trace their Christianity back to 52 AD, when St. Thomas the Apostle is said to have arrived. And within this family, there is a secret that's actually not so secret, going back many, many generations, and that is one or more members have died of drowning. So they call it the condition. And so one of the conceits of the book is this unknown condition, which as the book goes forward, is eventually sort of unraveled by the third generation of that family. So the book is about medicine, which I think of as life plus plus. It's about love. It's about family. It's also about a fascinating time in world history when, you had two world wars happening. You had tremendous changes in medicine. And most significantly in India, several centuries of colonial rule finally ended. So there's a lot going on in that period of time, which made it particularly juicy to try and set the novel there.
Wonderful. I want to get to some of those themes, but because we're JAMA, let's start with medicine. You talked about the condition that's a syndrome of familial drowning. To give listeners a kind of a little clinical flavor, the phenotype of the condition read to me a little bit like a complex partial seizure. There's kind of nystagmus and eye rolling and dissociation when people's affected family members' heads are submersed in water or immersed in water. And you and I agreed not to reveal the diagnosis to our listeners. What else is safe to say about the condition without giving away too much?
I will just say that it is a very rare disorder, and being a novelist, I took some liberties with it, ran with it, made it much more common than it ultimately is. It's not that the condition is a huge secret to medical folks reading this, who will quickly at least be able to say this is somewhere in the inner ear. But at least it's, to that in that time, in that era, so much was unknown. And, all you could do was label, just give it a label. For example, I always tell my medical students about, before anybody knew about bilirubin or knew anything about AST, ALT, our ancestors had identified this condition that they called acholuric jaundice. In other words, they knew that jaundice usually caused the urine to be deep yellow, but there were people who developed jaundice without the urine turning yellow, and it also ran in families. And well, we now know that this is hereditary spherocytosis. We have the mechanism to explain an observation, but the observations were always there. It's just that we're now able to give some meat and structure to it. And I think the reason I chose this is if you visit Kerala, which is in South India, on the coast, on the western coast, sort of just above Sri Lanka. It's a place that's full of water. It's basically bordered on one side by the Arabian Ocean and on the other side by this mountain range called the Western Ghats. And on those slopes is where all the spices grow. So it's also called the Spice Coast. But you have 44 rivers and countless lakes and miles of backwaters and ponds. And so, water is the way people get around. Water is the transport mechanism. And if you don't swim, you really are an anomaly there, because children swim before they can walk almost. And so to have this phenotype where these kids are confused by any sort of immersion in water, it disorients them. And then it also goes along in later years with deafness and eventually with more issues. But I think the other thing to say is that I've struggled with hearing loss the last decade or more. And so having characters wrestle with hearing loss, having hearing be an issue, hearing imbalance, was something that sort of crept organically into the book, mostly, I suppose, because I was wrestling with some of those things myself.
The family in the novel keeps a pedigree that kind of grows over the novel. I wonder if you can talk about the pedigree.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about societies like the one that I hail from, but really true of many, many groups in India, is that where arranged marriages are common and where the bride and groom don't know each other, the family's reputation means a great deal. And it's easily tainted by some incident or event, or even by a malicious rumor. So, oh, that family has a history of seizures, or that family has, a history of insanity. It doesn't take much to torpedo a prospective bride or groom's chances. And so, not just for that reason, I think there's a great deal of attention placed to family trees, and the marriage brokers know all the different branches of all the families, particularly in an insular community like this. The family tree in this book is particularly important because of this.
One of the things I'm getting at is I heard an interview with a writer who once said that the reader doesn't need to know everything about a novel's characters, but the author surely does. So I was wondering whether you actually had a pedigree for this family that was written out in order to structure how the condition evolves over generations in the story.
No, I actually didn't. No, I was at the point where the condition arrived in the book. I think I then just gave it to 7 generations without much more thought. No. But I must tell you that my book was inspired by my mother, actually, because I was looking to set a novel in some setting, and my 5-year-old niece at the time asked my mother, who was by then in her 70s, Grandma, what was it like when you were a little girl? And my mother was so taken with this question because, she was born on one continent in India and grew up there and worked in Africa, taught in New Jersey. I mean, so she had lived all over the world, and trying to convey to this little girl her childhood experience. And so my mother basically wrote in longhand this long 100-page manuscript with illustrations, with all the anecdotes of her childhood, all of which were familiar to me, but it just reminded me how rich a setting this was. But she was a very good illustrator, and one of her drawings was literally a tree. And on the branches of the tree was our family, going back only a few generations, maybe 2 or 3, but with my niece, her granddaughter, very prominently there as the centerpiece of the whole thing. It was very cute. So I suspect that my whole notion of the family tree came from some of those little seeds that Mom had planted. And she was actually still helping me with the novel and telling me things, sometimes the same thing again and again. She'd call to tell me, forgetting she told me before. She died when she was 94, but I'm sad she didn't get to see the novel, but she was certainly excited that the story was set there.
Well, bless her, and that's lovely. Leprosy is a second condition that really drives narrative, character, and plot. So let's focus on that.
I loved the opportunity to bring in leprosy in particular. I was of the generation of medical students, both in Africa and in India, who commonly saw leprosy on the streets and in the hospital as well, or the leprosariums. And It's interesting how that disease has just about vanished. The leprosariums are closed, but from every point of view, it's a fascinating disease. And in infectious disease, it's particularly interesting because we've learned so much about cell mediated immunity through leprosy, and that's before HIV came along. Of course, HIV jump started that process even more.
There are a few clinical pearls in here that your fiction writing taught me about the disease. One is that the transmission is not all that common. There's a burden in resource-limited countries, but it's not so easy to get leprosy from being around somebody who has the infection.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to explore the history of leprosy. Hansen's disease was a Norwegian, and his father-in-law was one of the early leprosy experts, and it was firmly believed in that era that this was a hereditary condition, passed down from one to another. And it never struck them that if that was the case, why was it that, sometimes people in close contact who were not related would get it too? And it was Hansen's observation of the bacteria that we call Mycobacterium leprae that changed everything. But I think what's even more fascinating about leprosy is that the realization that what was happening to these patients in terms of their losing their fingers and getting blind and so on was really from the fact that because they had numbness, they were hurting themselves without knowing it. There's a very famous story about Paul Brand. Paul Brand is a name very well known in America for his hand surgery, which he pioneered in South India. The story is that he was cycling past the hospital complex where he worked, and he saw a woman with leprosy trying to flip a chapati or a roti on a open fire, and she was having a hard time getting it, and so she just put her hand right in and turned it over, an action that would have immediately had our nerves shrieking. And that was his aha moment, that in leprosy the tremendous damage is really not the bacterium chewing away at the tissues as much as it is the repetitive destruction. The business about transmission is still a little bit unclear. We have clearly, with increasing sanitation and less poverty, it's disappeared from Europe and is disappearing slowly, I like to think, from India and Africa. So a lot of it is exposure, but then unique susceptibility also seems to matter. So you look at the famous experiment of Father Damien on the island of Molokai in Hawaii, a very famous leprosarium. Well, after many, many years of serving there, he got leprosy and ultimately died of it. But there were nuns working with him for just as long and who continued his legacy, and none of them were affected. So it really is a peculiar disease in that sense.
There were a couple other clinical insights in the telling of the story. One relates to leprosy in pregnancy. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Well, I think it used to be a belief, and I found it hard to actually corroborate this, that diseases like tuberculosis and leprosy exploded during pregnancy. And I actually had a hard time proving the fictional stance that I had already taken. But part of it is that there's just not much data, or not enough data to be sure. What we do know is that a newborn is uniquely susceptible to a mother who has leprosy. And so it's very common, sadly, for children born to a mother who has leprosy, if they're not immediately segregated, to get leprosy. And so there were items about transmission and epidemiology that I had to research. But the leprosy exploding during pregnancy, I think I took a little bit of a liberty with that. It's a little harder to prove.
Good to know. Another clinical pearl is you write that Lepromatous leprosy pushes out the wrinkles and the tuberculoid form doesn't. Is that based in evidence or is that literary license?
No, that's very much well known. It's amazing how people with Lepromatous leprosy, especially in the early stages, can look almost young because it does flatten out wrinkles. Sadly, over time, then they develop the leonine appearance with losing the eyebrows and, much more buildup. So, yeah, that is indeed very true. But I think the signature thing about leprosy, by and large, is what it does to the hands. And in places like India, the moment you get a claw hand, the suspicion is that this is leprosy. And you can get away with a lot of other things, but the claw hand arouses the stigma no matter what.
And just a note to listeners, leprosy is obviously, as Abraham said, not endemic to high-resourced countries. But there are cases. I did see a patient from West Africa in my primary care outpatient clinic who had hypopigmented, hypoaesthetic lesions on her upper extremities. That was likely to be leprosy. I wasn't around long enough to know whether the diagnosis was clinched. But it is something you can see in immigrant communities, and there does seem to be transmission from armadillos in the continental United States, interestingly.
I have to add that, I spent 11 years in El Paso, Texas, on the border. And I remember we had one of our family practice residents who was also from South India. He diagnosed a patient with leprosy who had a hypopigmented anesthetic lesion. And he was sort of poo-pooed by his attendings. And eventually it was confirmed that he was right. And I spoke to him. I said, this was a great diagnosis. And he said, "What, sir? Anybody could have told you it was leprosy." It's all a matter of how common the thing is. And it was something he recognized immediately.
A real surprise and pleasure to me was the number and detail of the procedures. An incomplete list includes an antrectomy, thyroidectomy, tracheotomy, skin grafts and lots of hand surgeries, and a CNS ventriculostomy. There's lots more. You're an infectious disease doc and an internist. What work did you do to prepare for writing those vignettes or scenes? And did you scrub in at Stanford to some of the procedures?
That's a great question, Michael. Thank you. I think when I finished medical school in India, we had to do a rotating internship and 3 months of surgery, 3 months of medicine. And in that 3 months of surgery, and even as a student, I got plenty of responsibility and, got to do lots of little surgeries. And on my last day, as a reward, I was allowed to do the gastrojejunectomy, not the vagotomy part, but I got to do it was a very powerful feeling. So I think I was very drawn to surgery. And but I loved everything. I especially loved medicine. And when I arrived in America for postgraduate training, it was a time that you might recall where surgical programs had this pyramidal structure, and they were infamous for taking foreign graduates in the first 3 years and then bumping you, and you could never finish. And I just didn't want to subject myself to that. Otherwise, I might have become a surgeon. But I was equally, thrilled with internal medicine. I like the sort of the sense of it's, you never will know this completely. It's always something to explore, which I kind of liked. So I think in turning my back on surgery, so to speak, I had a great sense of the richness of surgery, and it's been easy for me to vicariously romanticize and admire my surgical colleagues who, by and large, have humored me. So over the years, I've seen all kinds of surgeries, from liver transplants to spine surgeries. But it's amazing how, as you know, by just looking on YouTube, you can actually observe any operation you want. And so the challenge for a writer is, it used to be that you were satisfying the prurient interest of a reader who couldn't see something. They can see everything now. So you have sort of this meta level that you have to achieve, where the writing has to, do more than just show them a visual of something that they can already see. It has to reach a higher level of sort of meaning and explanation for it to work. Many years ago, when I was writing Cutting for Stone, I got to know a surgeon by the name of Moshe Shine, who's a general surgeon, but also very much a writer. He has a book of surgical aphorisms. He has a book of, abdominal surgery. He's sort of a good editor as well as a great surgeon. And he introduced me, because I was full of questions about what I was writing, to this wonderful listserv called SurgiNet that is out of Toronto. And the surgeons good-naturedly allowed me to be a voyeur. And so I know more about gallbladder surgery and anal fissure than most internists, just by vicariously listening to them. And many of them I would wind up writing to separately and consulting with them on aspects of something I was working on. So even though I'm not a surgeon, I felt like I belonged in a wonderful surgical community. And these guys were indulgent of my presence, and also understood that I wasn't proposing to do any surgery. I just wanted to write about it.
That's great. And for listeners who are squeamish about surgery, there's a lifetime run of other medicine in this novel: congenital hypothyroidism, gastric cancer, Charcot joints, cholinergic poisoning, and piebaldism and Cushing syndrome. That's a lot of interesting clues that you plant throughout the book. How do you select and organize that range of clinical medicine into your fiction?
I don't think it's planned out. It's just sort of something that organically seems to work at that moment. I wish I could say I had a master plan, but I always feel like as a reader, I enjoy books where there's some sort of technical matter that you're taught, whether it's, Horatio Hornblower teaching you how to sail, or, Tom Clancy and submarines, or all the many police procedural detective stories. I think as readers, we're fascinated by professionals doing something in their field. It makes us feel as though we're voyeurs in this craft that they do. And so, whenever I think, well, is this too much medicine? Is this too technical? Obviously, I must rely on my editor. And he always surprises me by wanting more rather than less, which I think speaks to the general public's fascination with anything technical, whether it's an airport or a hospital or a police station or the CIA. We want to know how these things work.
You're moving a little in the direction of my next question. The book has a chapter called The Craft of the Art, and I'd like to ask about the craft of your art. Can you talk about how you write, where you write, when you write? How does it all come out?
I tend to write on the computer, on the screen, but I always edit on paper. So I think there's this illusion that the computer allows you to do anything in a manuscript, but honestly, it only allows you to look at one page at a time. And I find it invaluable to print out the pages. And that's the only way to say these 30 pages go here and these 40 pages go in the round basket, or these 40 pages are great, but they don't belong in this book. I find that I can't do that unless I'm hefting paper and juggling it and moving things around. So the screen is just for composing, and then everything else happens with pen and ink. I also do a lot of drawing. So there's a lot of stuff on this whiteboard next to me, which began as my blueprint for the novel. But the trouble is that, once you get writing, the writing takes you in different directions, and you find that the blueprint no longer works. So you got to start over again. So this is probably now the most accurate version of the whiteboard, only because it's after the fact. It's caught up with what the novel already has. I think I'm a slow writer, and I envy the writers who seem to know their entire plot before they start. And I'm much more in the school that has to kind of discover it as I go along. And there are some wonderful novelists like John Irving who, he knows the last line of the book. He knows the first line of the book. He knows the ending of every chapter. And he says, and he has said to me, Abraham, if you don't know what's going to happen, how do you know what to hold back from the reader or when to reveal it? If you don't know what's going to happen, then you're not a writer. You're just an ordinary liar making it up as you go along. And conversely, I think there are writers like Michael Ondaatje. And I actually asked Michael on stage during an interview I was doing with him about this process. And, he said that he was much more likely to just write and see where it led him. And he made the great point that ultimately he and John Irving and myself, perhaps, we arrive at the same place. I arrive there knowing the whole novel, but I arrive there by writing my way through it. Whereas John might spend 6 months to a year plotting it all out before he starts writing. And even if you're the person who plots it out, you still are going to be surprised by what comes out in the writing. And John Irving often says that the real art of writing is in revision. And I think that's very true. So things become evident as you revise, and suddenly the story connects in different ways.
Wonderful. I imagine there are lots of listeners who would love to be you, to have an academic career focused on the kind of writing you do, or medicine and the humanities more generally, but they don't know how to make it work. What would you say to them? And what would be a successful reward system for the kind of creative writing or humanities work that you've so successfully integrated into your academic life at Stanford?
Well, I wouldn't want people to project too rosy a picture of, what my life used to be like. So for the longest time, until I came to Stanford, it was the writing was not necessarily something that there was much room for in terms of how I got paid, to get a salary. But when I moved to San Antonio to run the medical humanities section, and then when I came to Stanford, I think these were progressive institutions that felt that the writing was the equivalent of one's research. But obviously, I think you have to work hard to earn that. It's not something I could have negotiated when I hadn't written a book. So I think, in medicine, we give a lot of lip service to humanism and to all these qualities that we think are important, but we don't really put our money where our mouth is. If we did, we would be really rewarding primary care in a way that we don't. And my medical students are really smart. I mean, they look around, they see freestanding cancer centers, they see freestanding orthopedic centers. They don't see freestanding geriatric centers with a piano that plays in the lobby and valet parking. Clearly our burning need in this society is for good geriatric care, but that's not where our reimbursement lies. So there's a lot that's dysfunctional in the system, and I wish things like medical humanities were rewarded more, but it's very much an add-on, a bit of a luxury in most medical schools. But the fact that it exists as a division or a department in many medical schools, I think is a huge step from when I first began doing this sort of thing. The other thing I will say is that there are many physicians who want to write, and I think we're all blessed by having been at ringside, so to speak, at the most dramatic moments of people's lives, and we've been witnesses and catalysts. But very often, I find that they are unwilling to sort of accept that in order to write, you should really have a good sense of what's out there. You need to be aware of what is good writing out there, what's the threshold you need to achieve. And oftentimes people will just feel that because they thought it and conjured it up on a page, it must be good. And unfortunately, that's not enough. It needs some preparation, just as you wouldn't be able to write a symphony if you didn't really appreciate great music, and we're a musician. So not to overstate it, but there are some things about the craft, and certainly about what's out there, that you need to know in order to write. But I would say I like the idea of fostering writing, because I have this thesis that I write in order to understand what I'm thinking. So whether it be students writing in the local med school journal or blogging, I think these are all wonderful ways of keeping in touch with oneself, so to speak. And some of that writing is extraordinary and ascends to another level, and some of them have aspirations to do big things with it. Some don't, but it's all good. I wouldn't want to suggest that there's some sort of exclusive barrier that they have to cross. I think everybody should be writing. Everybody should be keeping a journal. But if the goal is to get to publication with a great publisher, it does help to know what's around there. It does help to read. And we're at a disadvantage there because we've spent all our careers keeping up with the medical stuff and the medical journals. So I still have to work hard to try and read as much contemporary fiction, which is my interest. And even then, I'm hopelessly behind.
Great segue. You published a great Kerala reading list in the New York Times last week to accompany the book. Listeners should check it out, but I wanted to ask you if there are any writers, physicians or not, who you especially admire for their imagination or technique and who you think deserve more attention than they've gotten in the public imagination.
I'll tell you some of my favorite writers who wind up going back to dip into when I'm in the process of writing this book or the previous one. And that is Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I'm just a great fan of his book, Love in the Time of Cholera. And I wound up listening to it on audio tape, maybe, I don't know, 4, 5, or 6 times, just because I just love the flow, the flow of his sentences, albeit translated to us. I'm not hearing it in the original Spanish. I think that one of the things that's underappreciated is how much poetry can influence a writer. So I'm often reading poetry and poets as I start my day as a way to sort of jumpstart the imagination, because the poetic license allows you to reach for images that the reader is then forced to connect that image with the sentiment, and it's sort of a emboldening way of opening up your imagination in the morning. So I read a lot of poetry, and I don't write poetry much, or I haven't tried to publish any of it, but I certainly read it because I think that's a much underappreciated thing. I mean, there are many contemporary doctor writers out there. I think that people like Oliver Sacks, Richard Selzer were really trailblazers. Richard Selzer, particularly, I got to know towards the end of his life, and I think he was the first doctor writer that I ever met, got to meet more than once, and he was a very gracious, lovely man. I think he wanted to be more widely read and recognized, and it probably frustrated him at times that he wasn't. But if you look at where he published and how he published, it was in all the best places. Oliver Sacks, similarly, I think did a wonderful job of not just describing something, but taking it to the next level. So he's always been a good model and example of wonderful physician writing. But the one physician writer who I most admire, who brought me to medicine, two of them actually, are Somerset Maugham. Not many people realize that he was a physician, and medical elements are not big in his novels, but there was enough of those medical elements in Of Human Bondage to make me feel medicine was a romantic, attractive calling. And similarly, the book The Citadel by A.J. Cronin. Now, he's very well known in the UK and used to be well known here, but that book, The Citadel, is given credit for starting the National Health Service in the UK. And it sort of shows you the power of fiction. One story about this Welsh mining town and the difficult conditions for physicians and patients is what allowed the public to be ready for this sea change called the National Health Service. For my colleagues who tend to read only nonfiction, I love to point out to them, you're a serious kind of guy, you love nonfiction, that's great. But think about it. What ended slavery in this country wasn't a president or a general. It was really one book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, that captured the public's imagination and made the idea of slavery unpalatable. And so I'm a big believer that fiction is the great lie that tells the truth about how the world lives. And I'm paraphrasing Camus. And I love scaring my medical students to say, if you don't have that experience of taking the little signals we call words on the page and making these mental movies, a part of your brain will atrophy. And I worry that it's already something we're in danger of seeing because we're just not used to doing that.
So let's pivot now to some broader themes, because as we've said, the book is about so much more than medicine. There's a lot of faith and spirit. You've mentioned the St. Thomas Christian community, the family's a part of. The novel's suffused with quotes and themes from the Old and New Testament. What struck me about that is there's no sense of an outsider status or no sense of difference for this small community, minority religion in this broader land. I wonder what you think of that or what made you write it that way.
Well, I think I was fascinated by the insular nature of our community, but also fascinated by the fact that even though we are an ancient Christian sect with all these roots with St. Thomas, we're also steeped in Hindu tradition, so many of the rituals of the St. Thomas Church and the wedding rituals and the building of the house rituals are really Hindu rituals. And, so I wasn't trying to in any way proselytize for one religion over the other. I think what's actually most remarkable is how, for the most part, especially in Kerala, people of all religions, worship together. It's not uncommon to see Hindus come to a church where, a saint is supposedly buried and have great faith in that. And conversely, Christians going to places of faith that are not of their faith. I think I wrote about faith not because I'm particularly religious and as I said, I'm not preaching in any way, but because it was true to that time. When I think of my grandmother and some of my great aunts, and even my mother, and even my father to this day, my father's 96, the religion is like a force in their life. My father was a deacon in the small church in Kerala as an altar boy, then someone who assists the priest. And his father did the same in that church. And my mother and father were married in that church. And on Saturday night, now that he lives in Newton with my older brother, he tunes into the same service from that church where his parents are buried. And, wow, it's that ritual and that tradition, just like all rituals, I think is an important piece of people's lives. And I suspect that in many other parts of the world, that are more willing to keep embracing their traditions, they're very comfortable with these rituals as being necessary and wholesome, and don't struggle as much as I think we do in postmodern societies to question it. And is there a God? Isn't there a God? Those discussions are just don't seem to come up. I particularly admired my Hindu friends, and I would often go to temple with them just because I could just tell it was such a cleansing ritual for them. They never debated, God or no God. They just sort of did this thing that was so comfortable and burnt the camphor, and on Fridays went to the temple, and it made them feel good. And I think I was trying to convey some of those qualities about religion in writing about it so much and quoting the Bible, because that's really what these lives were ruled by. It was these beliefs and their rituals and their faith.
Well, it's absolutely a force of charity and of caring and of good throughout the novel. Only good things. Kind of on a related note, the book unspools over the sweep of most of 20th century Indian history, but to me, it conspicuously avoided the convulsion of independence and partition in 1947, and I wondered why you made that choice.
Well, I'm not so sure it avoided it as much as the fact that in Kerala, because of that mountain range, and because for many, many years Kerala has sort of independently traded with the Arab world in terms of the spice market, Kerala was sort of insulated from much of the madness in the north. Not to say that they weren't fervent about independence and getting an end to colonial rule, but like some of the violence of the partition and Hindu-Muslim violence simply didn't happen over there. So it wasn't so much that I avoided it as much as I was being true to the fact that it was very much a minor note. I mean, it was very important, but it wasn't quite front and center as it might have been in some other parts of the world, for my characters anyway. So I think that's why. But I think it was clear how independence was affecting the lives of people in general in terms of the famine that was triggered by World War II, where Churchill was hoarding food for his troops while people were starving. There's just a lot of things that I did address that are less well known, but that are relevant to that whole business of the end of colonial rule.
Great. In 2019, you published a viewpoint called Humanizing Artificial Intelligence. We actually had a conversation about that. AI has been turbocharged, as you know, in the past 6 months with astonishing generative software that's promising a revolution in work and creativity. I wonder, given that you've thought about this, where you think we are with AI in medicine, and in particular, if you can speak to these large language models in literature, given the contrast between the labor and the love that you put into this novel and the promise that these tools can spit out something like it without any of the sweat or the heart or the investment.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to reflect on. I actually think that it's going to be hard for AI to sort of displace individual voices and writers and, unique people. A chat AI might sound a bit like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, but can they really come up with original stories that his imagination offered? Maybe they can. I don't know. But it will be very much like the difference between buying a watch that's, just made of simple parts versus something that has a tradition, a history, a story, a legacy behind it, which has more value. So I'm not particularly worried about this. I'm worried about different things. I think AI could be enormously helpful for our medical record keeping so that we can stop being the most glorified and highest paid clerks in the hospital and we can actually start caring for patients. I think it'll have the potential for exaggerating some of our biases, and our already unfair, inequitable healthcare delivery system might get even more so if many decisions are made based on our human decisions. If the model that they follow is our own biases, it'll just get amplified. But I think what concerns me more, Michael, is that as a society, I feel like all the success technology at some point is kind of like climate change, except the destruction isn't to the forests, rainforests, or to the atmosphere. It's more destruction of the soul, to the degree that we spend our entire days glued to the phone, which, sometimes I feel I'm in danger of that, And the more we're doing this and the more of it there is, I think that there's sort of a cumulative creep that does something to our existence. And I wonder if we won't come back to a simpler time where we just ration some of these things. There's nothing sadder for me than seeing a mother, for example, I mean, who am I to judge? But our parents strolling along with their kids, but they're on their phones. I mean, and maybe it's pressing and it's important and it's relevant, but I feel like everywhere I look, we are diminishing human to human interactions by the fact that we can be quite satisfied looking at something that's inanimate. So I worry about that.
Yeah, it's devices as much as artificial intelligence per se.
Yeah.
But I appreciate hearing your thoughts. So back to Covenant of Water, I want to run some quotes by you and get your reaction. The first you already spoke to, but have at it again. Fiction is the great lie that tells the truth about how the world lives.
I think that's absolutely true. Fiction is the great lie that tells the truth. More than that, I think stories are instructions for living. From our earliest childhood days, we instruct and are instructed by stories, and they get more complex. And why, as adults, would we ever decide to abandon that practice?
Second quote, we don't have children to fulfill our dreams. Children allow us to let go of the dreams we were never meant to fulfill.
Yeah, I love that particular line. I think I've used it more than once. I used it in the last book as well. But I think it's true. I think the moment you hold your newborn in your hands, all of a sudden you have become much less important than the welfare of this being. I think I felt that with every child. I didn't always live up to being the parent I might have been, but I certainly felt powerfully that I was no longer as relevant as their welfare.
Third quote, to see the miraculous in the ordinary is a more precious gift than prophecy.
I love that quote. If I actually wrote that, then that's great. But I think I did. I think that you and I share the same sense of, from the things we witness in our profession, we have a greater appreciation, I suspect, for the ordinary everyday life. We just know how easily it could be derailed. So seeing the miraculous in the ordinary is very much what we do. I would go so far as to say that every day above ground is a great day. It's a blessing because you and I can see the alternatives, as your listeners can too.
Wonderful. The food in the novel is incredible, right? There's jaggery, jackfruit halwa, beef and fish curry and fry. Will there be a Covenant recipe book tie-in?
Well, maybe there should be. There's certainly in the acknowledgments at the back, I befriended a woman who wrote a book called the Kerala Cookbook, and she turned out to be a treasure trove of so much more than recipes and sharing anecdotes about family and eccentric people, and just became a great reader of the book. So, in a sense, her book already has done that. So I'm not sure that I'll do something separate.
Great. Mariamma is the prodigal child in the story. She realizes the family dream of unlocking the secret of the condition. The book leaves her at age 26 in 1977 as a primary care outpatient clinic doc at the new Perambul Hospital. She's also confronting her family history. We're in 2023 now. She's 72 years old. Who is she now, and what's her career and life been like?
Well, I'd like to think that she's been, in many ways, I think it's left to the reader to project what's going to happen. So very often when a book sort of ends, we don't end as readers. We want to just sort of project forward. So my projection is that she was very successful, still at the same place, having finished all her training and built that into a referral center of some kind. Yeah.
And this is a related question, and I'll tell you how it's related. On your Facebook page or your publisher's Facebook page, you posted a photo of yourself in the room where you were recording the audiobook. And above the laptop are black and white photographs of two women. Are those your mom and your Amachi?
Those were my mother when she was young and my mother the year before she died. So in many ways, this whole book became a tribute to her, more so when she passed away. So mostly because it was based on her story in the sense that she gave me the notion that that's where I should set the story. But then also because she didn't get to see it. So I dedicated the book to her memory.
Beautiful. One of the reasons I mentioned that is I finished the book and I took a breath and then I went back to page 1 and reread it, mostly. Partly to pick up on things I missed, the hints you dropped along the way towards the end and the resolution of the story, and partly to prepare for this interview. And I had the sensation, kind of the satisfaction of seeing relatives, people I care about, who I know have become older or ill or have passed, but seeing them when they're young again and beautiful, and their fates aren't determined yet. And I think that's something we have when we put up pictures of our loved ones in our personal spaces. And this novel kind of simulated that for me. Life is lived forward but understood backwards. And rereading your novel is a way to kind of understand these lives forwards. And that was a reaction that I never had before, partly because I haven't reread a book in a long time. And I wanted to share that with you and get your thoughts.
Well, that is just beautiful. I wish I could have written down every word you just said, because I think that's actually profound. I mean, I love the sense of, I don't know of anything else that allows us to buy time, Michael. So you pick up a good novel, and if you're lucky, you have the story of several generations and centuries, and you put it down, and it's still Tuesday. That sense of transformation, I think, is only offered by a novel. But as you said, I think it's also a powerful way of getting to know oneself. If a novel resonates, it's because it's got echoes of all the things that we've witnessed and all the things that we know to be true, and a novelist is simply affirming some of these things for us.
You've been really patient with me and with your time. Anything else you want to say that you think listeners or readers should know about?
I want to congratulate Gemma on having such a commitment to literature, because I remember the art on the cover seemed like this hugely progressive thing for a medical journal to do. But the development of the page that you run has been extraordinary. And I look to it with a great deal of excitement with every issue, wondering what you're going to come up with. So thank you, and thank you, Jama, for believing that humanities matter. It's not all science, it's science and art, and you guys are walking the walk, so to speak. So thank you for that.
That's very kind of you. I probably have 100 more questions, but we've run a little long. Abraham, you're the best. This was a thrill. Good luck with the launch and your book tour. Thanks so much for talking to me.
Thank you, Michael.
That was Abraham Verghese of Stanford University, author of Cutting for Stone and the new novel, The Covenant of Water. Thank you for listening to this JAMA Author Interviews podcast. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com. This episode was produced by Daniel Morrow at the JAMA Network. The audio team also includes Marilyn Ferkaluk, Audrey Foreman, Lisa Harden, Daniel Musisi, Hannah Park, Shelley Steffens, and Dr. Linda Brubaker, Senior Editor for Multimedia. I'm Mike Berkowitz, and thanks for listening.